The Railroad Foreman. September 13th, 1848, Cavendish, Vermont, 4:30 in the afternoon. Phineas Gage was 25 years old and employed as a foreman on the Rutland and Burlington Railroad. By all recorded accounts from his supervisors and co-workers, he was considered responsible, efficient, and well-liked. His employer, a man named John Harlow, who later became his physician, described him in writing as the most efficient and capable foreman in their employ. That afternoon, Gage was using a tamping iron, a 13-pound, 3-foot 7-inch metal rod, to pack explosive powder into a rock bore. The powder detonated prematurely. The iron rod entered below his left cheekbone and exited through the top of his skull. It landed approximately 80 feet away. Phineas Gage did not lose consciousness immediately. He was carried to a cart, sat upright during the journey to town, and walked up a flight of stairs to the room where he would be treated. He was speaking coherently within minutes of the accident. Here is where the documented record becomes significant. Within weeks of his physical recovery, those who knew him, his employer, his crew, the physician who treated him, began noting specific behavioral changes. These observations were recorded in letters and medical journals at the time, not reconstructed from memory later. Harlow wrote that Gage was fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity, which was not previously his custom. He noted that Gage had difficulty following through on plans he made, would announce intentions and then abandon them hours later, and had lost what Harlow described as deference to others. Gage lost his railroad job. He spent time exhibiting himself and the tamping iron at P.T. Barnum's museum. He worked as a long-distance stagecoach driver in Chile for several years, a job that required sustained attention and routine, which, researchers would later note, complicates the simpler narratives about his impairment. In 2012, researchers at UCLA used modern imaging techniques on Gage's preserved skull to model which neural pathways the iron rod most likely damaged. Their findings, published in PLOS I, indicated disruption to prefrontal white matter tracts, specifically those connecting the prefrontal cortex to regions associated with decision-making and social behavior. Frontal lobe damage altering personality and executive function is the accepted explanation in medical literature. What that explanation does not fully account for is the Chilean stagecoach period, roughly 4 years during which Gage reportedly maintained steady employment and behavior consistent enough to keep a demanding job. This has never been fully integrated into the standard account of his deterioration. Harlow's original description has also been shown by historian Malcolm Macmillan to have been partially embellished in later retellings. The degree to which the overnight change narrative reflects the documented record versus a constructed medical mythology remains an open question among historians of science. The anonymous online account. Not all behavioral shifts happen to individuals in moments of physical crisis. In 2019, researchers at Stanford Internet Observatory published an analysis of social media behavior patterns. The study was focused on identifying coordinated inauthentic behavior, accounts operating in ways inconsistent with genuine human use. In the course of that research, they documented what they described in the paper as behavioral discontinuities in a subset of accounts that did not meet the threshold for classification as bot networks, but also did not behave like ordinary users. One category was described simply as single-user accounts that exhibited a documented, time-stamped change in content, posting frequency, vocabulary, and engagement pattern, occurring within a 24 to 48-hour window, without any corresponding public life event to explain the shift. The researchers identified 23 such accounts across the platforms they studied. Account designation in the paper, ID-7, a Twitter account with approximately 4,200 followers, active since 2011. For 6 years, the account posted primarily about local sports, regional weather events in what appeared to be the American Midwest, and occasional commentary on gardening. Posting frequency, roughly 3 to 5 times per week. Language patterns were consistent. Response time to replies was irregular in the way genuine users typically are, clustered in evenings and weekends. On a Tuesday in October 2017, the account's posting frequency increased to approximately 40 posts per day. The subject matter shifted entirely to political content. The vocabulary changed measurably. Linguists who reviewed the data noted a shift in what they called functional word usage, words like prepositions and articles that are difficult to consciously manipulate. The response time to replies became uniform, clustered in patterns inconsistent with a single person managing an account around work or sleep. Platform metadata made available to the researchers showed no change in the account's IP address or device fingerprint during this period. The account appeared to be accessed from the same location, using the same device, before and after the behavioral shift. Stanford researchers declined to classify the account definitively. Their paper noted it as an ambiguous case. It could represent an account that was sold or transferred, a user who underwent a significant life change, or something consistent with coordinated inauthentic behavior that did not fully meet their classification criteria. The account was eventually suspended by Twitter in 2018 in a broad enforcement action. The reason given was platform manipulation and spam, a category that covers a range of behaviors. Because the device fingerprint did not change, the sale or transfer explanation requires an additional assumption that the new operator was using the same physical device. This is possible, but not confirmed. The researchers noted it in a footnote. It was not addressed further in the paper. The Trappist monk. Some behavioral changes are self-reported and corroborated by institutional records. Thomas Merton was 26 years old in December 1941. He was an English-born academic teaching at a small college in New York. He had published some poetry, maintained an active social life by his own account, drank regularly, and had fathered a child whose fate was rendered unclear by the Second World War. On December 10, 1941, 3 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Merton arrived at the Abbey of Gethsemani in Kentucky. He had visited once before, months earlier. On this second visit, he did not leave. He requested admission to the monastic community, surrendered his personal belongings, and adopted the name Father Louis. The change is well documented because Merton himself documented it. His autobiography, The Seven-Story Mountain, published in 1948, describes the period leading up to that decision in detail. His Columbia University records show a student who was, by academic standards, functioning and engaged until that exit point. Colleagues who knew him described the shift as abrupt in letters reviewed by biographers. The Abbey of Gethsemane's intake records, reviewed by biographer Michael Mott, confirm Merton's arrival date and the completeness of his departure from his previous life within a single day's decision. The religious conversion is documented and self-described. Merton's own writing acknowledges a longer, internal process leading to this moment, but the external behavioral change, visible to others, measurable in terms of presence and absence, occurred overnight. Whether the internal process that preceded it constitutes a full explanation for the behavioral abruptness, or whether something precipitated the timing specifically in those 3 days between Pearl Harbor and his arrival at Gethsemane, is not addressed in the public record. Merton never fully explained the timing. The portfolio manager. In 2008, researchers studying behavioral responses to financial crisis at the University of Chicago documented a series of case studies involving professional traders and portfolio managers whose decision-making patterns changed measurably in the weeks surrounding the Lehman Brothers collapse in September of that year. Most of those cases followed a predictable arc: elevated risk aversion following catastrophic market events. That was the expected finding. One case in the study, identified only by professional role and age cohort to protect confidentiality, was described as anomalous. Subject: a portfolio manager in his early 40s, employed at a mid-sized asset management firm in the Midwest. For the 11 years documented in his trading records, he maintained what the researchers described as a statistically consistent risk profile. Not aggressive, not conservative. His decisions fell within a narrow band of variance that the researchers described as remarkably stable across multiple market cycles, including the dot-com bust. In the 48 hours following September 15, 2008, the date Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy, this manager's trading behavior shifted outside that band in a direction that the researchers had not anticipated. He became more risk-tolerant, not less. In the weeks that followed, he made a series of contrarian purchases in distressed assets at a time when nearly every measurable indicator of peer behavior showed increased risk aversion. He did not lose money. His fund outperformed its benchmark by a significant margin over the following 18 months. The researchers cross-referenced his trading decisions with news consumption patterns available through the firm's internal systems. In the 48-hour window following Lehman's collapse, he consumed significantly less financial news than in any comparable period in the preceding 3 years. He was present in the office. He simply stopped reading the feeds. The researchers classified this under information filtering as a coping strategy, and noted it as potentially consistent with literature on expert decision-making under uncertainty, specifically work suggesting that experienced practitioners sometimes perform better when shielded from real-time noise. They acknowledged the case was not sufficient to generalize from. What prompted the information filtering on that specific day was not asked of the subject, who declined to be interviewed. The researchers noted this limitation. Whether the behavior was deliberate, habitual, or situational was not determined. The village teacher. In 1995, researchers with the Post-Genocide Reconciliation Documentation Project in Rwanda, a joint effort between the UN and several academic institutions, interviewed hundreds of individuals as part of behavioral and psychological impact assessments. The work was not published in mainstream outlets. It remains in academic archives. Among the documented cases, a primary school teacher in a rural district outside Kigali. She had been teaching for 12 years prior to 1994. Her colleagues and community members, interviewed separately, described her consistently as reserved, methodical, and structured in her routines. She arrived at school at the same time every day. She used the same lesson formats she had developed early in her career. She was described as predictable in a positive professional sense. Following the genocide, during which she had hidden 11 people in and beneath her home for a period of weeks, a fact corroborated by the individuals she had hidden, her behavior changed in ways that her colleagues documented without being asked specifically about change. They noted the changes as facts, not as anomalies, in their own interview responses. She began teaching subjects outside her assigned curriculum. She reorganized her classroom without institutional approval. She stopped adhering to the scheduled lesson calendar and instead taught based on what she observed students needed on a given day. She began arriving at school before dawn and remaining after dark. When interviewed directly, she did not describe a decision to change. She described a change in what she was able to tolerate remaining the same. School enrollment in her class increased by approximately 40% in the 18 months following the genocide, at a time when enrollment in the district generally declined due to population displacement. This is documented in district education records. Researchers classified her behavioral shift as consistent with post-traumatic growth, a documented psychological phenomenon in which individuals exposed to extreme stress develop increased functionality in specific domains. The specific mechanism by which post-traumatic growth produces behavioral change, why it manifests in some individuals and not others exposed to comparable events, remains one of the open questions in trauma psychology. Her case was cited in at least 2 academic papers. Neither paper could explain the mechanism, only describe the outcome. The software engineer. In 2013, the MIT Media Lab published a study on what researchers called human behavioral signatures, stable, measurable patterns in how individuals interact with digital tools over time. The research drew on anonymized data from a group of 50 software engineers employed at a mid-sized technology firm, who had consented to activity monitoring as part of a workplace productivity study. The researchers were looking at keyboard dynamics, application usage patterns, communication frequency, and work session timing, data points that, in aggregate, create a surprisingly consistent behavioral fingerprint for each individual over time. In 32 of the 50 subjects, these fingerprints remained essentially stable over the 18-month study period. Small variances, but nothing that fell outside what the researchers described as a normal confidence interval. In 4 of the 50 subjects, the fingerprints changed significantly within a short window. In 3 cases, correlated with known life events: a job change, a bereavement, a marriage. In the 4th case, identified in the paper only as Subject 31, the behavioral signature changed across multiple measured dimensions simultaneously, within a period the researchers estimated at 36 to 48 hours, with no documented corresponding life event. Subject 31's communication frequency with colleagues dropped by roughly 60% over 2 weeks following the shift. Work session length increased by an average of 2 hours per day. Application usage showed a pronounced move away from collaborative tools toward individual coding environments. The content of communications that did occur, reviewed with subject consent, shifted in measurable ways the researchers described as increased procedural specificity and decreased social content. Subject 31 was not ill. HR records showed no documented leave, no reported personal events, no performance issues. Researchers asked Subject 31 directly. He reported that he had, on the night in question, decided to pursue a specific long-term technical project that he had been postponing for several years. He described this as a decision that had clarified for him that evening. The researchers classified the case as consistent with a goal commitment event, a term from motivational psychology describing a moment when a long-held intention crystallizes into behavioral action. They noted that such events can produce rapid behavioral reorganization, consistent with what they observed. What triggered the clarification on that specific evening, rather than any other, was not investigated. Subject 31 reported no specific precipitating event. The researchers noted this as unremarkable, given the existing literature. Intention crystallization does not always have an identifiable trigger. Whether that explanation is complete or whether it simply describes the outcome without fully accounting for the mechanism is a question the paper does not resolve. The former intelligence analyst. In 2018, Georgetown University's Center for Security and Emerging Technology published a series of anonymized case studies as part of a broader study on decision-making patterns in national security professionals following retirement or career transition. One case involved a former intelligence analyst who had worked for a federal agency for 22 years. The study does not name the agency. The subject is identified only by career category and years of service. For the duration of his documented career, he maintained a communication profile consistent with what the study described as need-to-know compartmentalization habits, a pattern common in intelligence community professionals, involving limited personal disclosure, careful information sourcing before sharing, and what researchers described as measurably low social media engagement by the standards of his age cohort. He retired in January 2016. For approximately 8 months following retirement, his observable behavior, as documented through social media activity he began for the first time post-retirement, public event attendance recorded through media photographs, and accounts from family members interviewed for the study, remained consistent with his career-era patterns. He spoke cautiously. He disclosed little. He maintained what his family described as a professional distance, even in social settings. In September 2016, this pattern changed. Within a period his family estimated at a few days, he became what one family member described as suddenly talkative. He joined multiple community organizations. He began giving informal talks at a local library on topics related to his former career, cleared through proper channels with his former employer, the researchers verified. He called relatives he had not spoken with in years. His former employer confirmed to the Georgetown researchers that he had completed all required post-retirement debriefings and disclosure reviews before the September 2016 change in behavior. There was no official constraint on his communication that changed at that time to explain the behavioral shift. The researchers classified this under delayed decompression, a documented pattern in which individuals from high-stress, high-discretion professional environments undergo a behavioral transition that is delayed well beyond the formal separation from the work environment. What specifically triggered the transition in September 2016, 8 months after retirement, rather than gradually over time or immediately following retirement, was not determined. The subject participated in the study but, the researchers noted, was not forthcoming on this specific point. Whether this reflects ongoing professional habit, genuine inability to identify a trigger, or deliberate omission was not ascertained. The overnight shift. Not all behavioral changes are about personality, motivation, or identity. Some are biological, and even the biological ones have aspects that remain incompletely understood. In 2016, researchers at the University of Surrey published findings from a study examining gene expression in human subjects undergoing shift work schedule changes. The study involved 22 volunteers who transitioned abruptly from normal daytime schedules to overnight shift schedules over a period of 3 days. The researchers were measuring circadian rhythm disruption at a molecular level, specifically looking at which genes were being actively expressed and when, relative to the subject's new sleep-wake cycles. The key finding, which received some coverage in science journalism at the time, was that approximately 97% of the genes previously identified as operating on a circadian rhythm lost their rhythmic patterns within the study period. The researchers described this as a near-total disruption of the molecular clock. What the study also noted, in less reported sections, was that 6 of the 22 subjects demonstrated what the researchers described as a significantly accelerated adaptation pattern. Their molecular clocks began resynchronizing to the new schedule at a rate considerably faster than the group average, and in 2 cases, faster than the researchers had considered within the expected range based on prior literature. These 6 subjects did not share a common age, weight, chronotype, or any other characteristic that the researchers measured. They could not identify a predictive variable. Behaviorally, the 6 faster adapting subjects reported subjective well-being scores, tiredness, alertness, mood, that diverged from the group within 36 to 48 hours of the schedule change. The group had been advised of the study design, but not told which outcome was expected or desired. The biological data, gene expression readings, was objective and not subject to self-reporting bias. The molecular divergence was measurable and documented. The researchers attributed the individual variation to what they described as differential circadian plasticity, a real and studied phenomenon, though one for which the genetic or physiological basis remains incompletely characterized. Why those specific 6 subjects demonstrated greater circadian plasticity, and whether this plasticity is reliably reproducible, stable over time, or environmentally influenced, was not determined by this study. The researchers called for further work. That further work, to the extent it has been published, has not yet produced a clean mechanistic explanation. The activist who stopped. In 2007, Human Rights Watch published a report on activist suppression in a Central Asian country. The report documented, among many other cases, the behavioral trajectory of a human rights documentarian who had spent 11 years compiling evidence of state-level abuses in his region. He had been arrested twice, released both times without trial. He had continued working after each arrest, and his output, in terms of documented cases and published reports filed with international organizations, had actually increased following the second arrest. Multiple colleagues interviewed by Human Rights Watch described him as someone whose response to pressure was to accelerate rather than withdraw. In early 2006, he stopped, not gradually, not following a third arrest, not following an identifiable threat. He closed his documentation office. He declined requests for interviews. He moved to a different city. He took a job unrelated to human rights work. His colleagues reported that, in the weeks before this change, he appeared to be functioning normally. He had not spoken of leaving. He had, in fact, accepted a commitment to present findings at a conference scheduled for 3 months later, a commitment he subsequently withdrew from. Human Rights Watch researchers attempted to contact him as part of their 2007 report documentation. He declined to speak with them. He did not explain his decision. His exit from human rights work is documented, not explained. Human Rights Watch researchers noted the case and explicitly declined to speculate. Their report documented the behavioral change as an observed fact, listed possible factors, including undisclosed threats, personal circumstances, or psychological burnout, and noted that none of these had been confirmed. The organization, which specializes in determining facts in opaque circumstances, chose to leave the explanation blank. Their report noted that the subject's privacy and safety interests required that. What ended 11 years of documented activity in a period of days without a publicly observable cause was not determined. The patient who woke up speaking Spanish. The final case in this documentary is perhaps the most medically documented category of overnight behavioral change, and also one of the least understood. Foreign accent syndrome is a speech disorder that has been documented in the medical literature since the 1940s. It involves the sudden onset of speech patterns that listeners perceive as a foreign accent, following neurological events such as stroke, traumatic brain injury, or, in rarer documented cases, severe migraines. This is not a psychological phenomenon in the popular sense. It is measurable in acoustic analysis. Researchers can record and quantify the changes in vowel duration, consonant articulation, and prosody that produce the perception of a different accent. The change is real and documentable. It is not a person adopting an accent voluntarily. There have been roughly 150 documented cases in the peer-reviewed literature as of 2024. Of those, approximately 60 have been studied in sufficient clinical detail to allow analysis of the neurological basis. In 2016, researchers at the University of Oxford published an analysis of 49 such cases. They found that in 37 of the 49, the syndrome followed a detectable pattern of brain damage or disruption that they could at least partially localize. In the remaining 12 cases, standard neuroimaging did not reveal the expected lesion or disruption pattern. The patients in those 12 cases had not had strokes. They had not sustained traumatic brain injuries. Several reported onset following severe migraines. One case, described in the Oxford analysis, involved a woman in her mid-50s whose speech pattern changed overnight. She woke speaking in a manner that her family and speech pathologists described as resembling a French accent. She is British. She had never lived in France. She reported no neurological event the previous evening, only a migraine she described as more severe than usual. Her MRI was unremarkable. A follow-up MRI 6 months later was unremarkable. Her accent, documented in speech samples stored with the Oxford Research Group, persisted for at least 3 years following onset. Acoustic analysis of her speech, before and after, is documented and archived. The change is measurable and not disputed. The Oxford researchers categorized her case as foreign accent syndrome secondary to migraine, a recognized subclassification. They noted that the mechanism by which migraines produce lasting speech changes without visible neurological damage is not understood. The condition is documented. The trigger event in her case is plausible but not proven. The neurological pathway remains, as of the current literature, unidentified. The researchers did not speculate. They noted the gap.